important stuff to talk about tonight. I'm Vicky Perrett. I'm the President of Geelong Sustainability, and so I welcome you all here tonight on what is International Women's Week. So a very big special welcome. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are part of the community here today. Now, with that welcome out of the way, the format for this evening is that we have three expert speakers who have come down from Melbourne, and so I'm going to start with a little introduction about Geelong sustainability and some of the things that we're doing here locally, and then we'll hand over and each speaker will come to the stage in turn and give their presentation, and then at the end we'll invite all three speakers up and they will take your questions for another 20 or so minutes. So don't worry, hold on to your questions. You'll certainly get a chance to go through them. Okay, so this is the first seminar for 2019 in our series called Clever Living. We started this series last year really in response to a very strong demand for people to find out quality information and contemporary information about how they could adjust how they live in order to live more sustainably and more economically and more comfortably going forward. So this is the first one, and we think this is a really important topic, and it will lead into our workshop that we're running in part of the Melbourne Design Week. A little bit more of that in a moment. Okay. If I pull that over here, you can see and I can read. So Geelong Sustainability, we've been running since 2007. We're a not-for-profit community group, an incorporated association. We're a registered environmental organisation, also a tax-exempt charity. But we run on volunteer passion, and so therefore we tend to focus on where we can have the most impact, and so we adopt and make use of the One Planet Living principles, but we do spend a lot of our time networking and building partnerships and alliances, and we also have started auspicing other groups as a way of extending what we're able to achieve. And we've been growing rapidly, and we definitely believe in Margaret Mead. It's all up to us. Yeah. So our mission is about informing and inspiring and connecting our communities so that they can live more sustainably and we can protect our natural environment. So the main things we tend to focus on, we run campaigns, and there's a campaign, there's a petition going around there. If you'd like to pass that around the room, if anyone's interested in signing our petition for a container deposit scheme, that would be great. So we help to campaign and advocate, we coordinate projects, and we organise events, which are all geared around sharing quality information and building community resilience and advocating for effective action. So we adopted the One Planet Living principles a number of years ago, as has the City of Greater Geelong and Barwon Water, and we tend to align our efforts in relation to these activities. Given the current global emergency, we have in the past focused very much on the zero carbon energy principle, but more recently the zero waste principle has taken over, as it's taken over a lot of people's attention in more recent times. And the other priority for us going forward is this micro eco village project, which we really want to get started for Geelong. So some of the community energy projects, you may have heard about this. We started doing a donation model project at a local primary school in South Geelong. Then we moved on thanks to some funding from the state government through the New Energy Jobs Fund grant. We've had 2 grants from them, and that's enabled us to set up a investment model. So out at Max, the aged care facility in North Geelong, the community has funded the installation of 156 kilowatts of solar there, and they are now doing really well, and we've had a very good summer for solar, so it's performing very well. And the investors are slowly going to be repaid their principal with interest at better than bank interest, and it's a real win for the investors, it's a win for the facility, and it's a win for the environment when we look at the carbon emissions reductions. And the residents really love having clean energy. Last year we ran a very large program, a solar bulk buy program, and that resulted in 1.3 megawatts of solar being added and 1.4 megawatts of battery storage. And we're now moving on to look at the opportunities of setting up some peer-to-peer trading and some other next steps on from there. One other big project that we are now undertaking is called the Climate Safe Rooms Project, and that's going to retrofit a living room for 20 vulnerable residents that live in Geelong. It's a collaboration with the City of Greater Geelong, with Kildonan, with Deakin, with CSIRO and with EcoMaster. But they will assess the energy efficiency of the space. They will then retrofit insulation, draft proofing, maybe replace white goods, give them a small split system, give them a small solar cell system on their roof, so that those residents will have somewhere safe regardless of the weather, and that they will be able to afford to turn on that energy efficient air conditioner. So we think it's a wonderful project. The other thing that we've started to do is actually reach out to the other environmental groups in our region, and there are a lot of them. So there's 7 or 8 groups that have formed this BRACE Alliance for the Barwon region, and we're really trying to push more community energy into this space, and looking at the opportunities for solar gardens and having a regional power hub in the Barwon area. One of the other things that we're also doing is this year is that moving on to create a social enterprise and to be able to offer some independent solar feasibility assessments for businesses, and also the course scorecard assessment, which is a state government initiative. So the other things that we do in our spare time is, and where we probably traditionally started, was running events. So we've coordinated Sustainable House Day for the last 10 years. It's our biggest annual event, and I think there are over 2,500 visitors to the homes that opened last year. This Clever Living series is an important event series that we run. We also run these fun little evening classes called Life Learning, where you can come along and learn all sorts of things. And I think you might have seen some of the events that were rolling through in that little promo prior to starting the seminar. The war on waste is a really big focus for us in recent times, and the paradigms have got to shift, and we've all got a responsibility there to try and do better. We've had an event, a role at a number of public events, but we're also doing a lot of advocacy work in that space. And with that said, I would remind everyone that the City of Greater Geelong is developing a new waste and recycling strategy, and they have a Have Your Say out at the moment. So please have your say, because we really want them to aim high. And we have a mayor who's very inclined to incineration, which is going to be a dreadful outcome. So anyway, so we also do a number of projects. Some of you may have seen our directory. We've now got a little War on Waste flyer, which you're welcome to help yourself to over on the table. And we also partnered with Max and Cycling Geelong to create the first chapter of Cycling Without Age in Geelong, which is just a wonderful initiative where trained pilots take out the elderly to get some fresh air and some wind in their hair, as they describe it. And our other big project is this micro-village project, which tonight is kicking off, because we're all going to learn about some of these wonderful new initiatives. So without further ado, we're going to switch over. No, I'm going to introduce you to our 3 speakers. So they've drawn straws for the order in which they're going to present. And so we're going to start with Catherine from MGS Architects. So I'll give you a very brief introduction to each of them, and I'm sure they're going to go on to tell you a lot more of some of their very interesting work that they've done. So Catherine has experience both in working and researching about housing developments in Germany and the Netherlands, and she's passionate about the opportunity for regional cities to draw upon the lessons from emerging citizen-led developments models in Melbourne, and in order to promote more diverse and inclusive neighbourhoods that address some of the shortcomings of traditional investor-orientated development, which I think we're all well aware of. Our second speaker is Tim Riley, and he's the founder of Property Collectives, which is a citizen-led housing model that brings together people to develop houses together, and they save quite a lot of money along the way. So his aim is to create buildings with architecture and environmental integrity that generate real financial and social capital for all members of the collective. And our third speaker is Lisa Garner, who's a designer and a researcher at the Swinburne Institute of Urban Transition, and she likes using design research and testing to propose alternative models with a higher environmental and social performance. And she brings a fresh approach to planning issues to enable high quality living environments. So I think you'll agree we're in for a treat tonight, and we're just going to swap over, and I'll invite Catherine to the podium. The stage. See how it works. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. It's really great to hear all the things you've got going on. It's incredible. Yes. Great. So I thought I would start with a bit of a personal question. How old are you? So you don't need to shout it out, just keep that number in your head. And how old will you be in 20 years' time? So you've got a new number in your head. Think about that number and think about who will you be living with? Will it be your partner? Will your children still be at home? Would you consider living with your friends? And what kind of environment will you be living in? Where will you be living? What would your dream situation be? Because this is the type of housing that is currently being built in Geelong and a lot of other places in Australia. So we really have that option of the, big house on a small lot on the very edge of the city that's in a very car-dominated situation. Or you can have the apartment in the city, which is great because you can walk places, but is this really the type of environment you want to live in? So I think the type of development that we're building has some issues. It's not the most sustainable way of living. It's also not that healthy for us. And I think importantly, it creates a bit of social isolation as well. And I think we tend to downplay this, but it's very important that social relationships are as crucial to our health and our longevity as you can have the same success in kind of giving up smoking, doing more exercise, eating well, but having that community connection, having that social network is just as important to our health as all of those things. So how can we think about a type of housing that is more sustainable, that does create a greater sense of community and hopefully is a bit more affordable as well? And to that end, I've been looking at examples like this one in Amsterdam, which is, I guess you can put it broadly under the category of deliberative development. So that's that idea that we're talking about citizen-led development. And so in this case, we've looked at examples from Amsterdam, Delft and Zurich, and started to tease out how we could start to apply some of these things in Geelong. So the structure of my talk today will be really, what is this deliberative development? What does that mean? Taking you through 3 examples, and then we'll talk about those opportunities. And so in terms of deliberative development, if people ask me, I tend to say, imagine if you and 10 of your friends pooled your money and built your own apartment building or cluster of smaller homes. And so what kind of benefits would you get from that? The first one is that you would want higher quality housing. You would want high quality materials. You would also want more sustainable options because you know that you're going to be living in there for the next 10 to 15 years at least. And compared to the way most housing is delivered, which is more of that investor model. And so if you are an investor, you don't really care what the running costs of that place are going to be. This type of development tends to be more affordable as well, and so Tim will get more into the detail of that later. But essentially, if you are pooling your money with your friends and doing your own development, you're becoming your own developer. And in that way, you don't have to pay the developer for their profit for making that happen. So I think Tim has more detail on this, but you can save up to 30% of the total cost of the housing because you're cutting out the profit, you're cutting out the need for a marketing suite, that kind of thing. This type of development tends to create community as well. So as you can imagine, it's quite a task to kind of get 10 or 30 people together and to take them through that process. So through your meetings every 2 weeks and that kind of level of investment you have with it tends to create community. And what's interesting is that people start to want to have shared facilities as well. So over the course of the time that you live in this neighbourhood, that you might tend to have a greater need for sharing things. And that's again something that standard development does not provide. And I think what's interesting as well is that this type of development not only creates community, but it gives back to the community. This is an example from Berlin of an apartment building that was built in this model, and they decided to have a shared space on the ground floor that can be used for events for the local community, but also they had a Syrian refugee staying in here because they had a shared bedroom that they could use. But I think more than that, it also gives back to the community in that you're creating this high quality place that is more open and more shared. And I think it's really important to mention that this is only one model. So we've got, if we want to have an equitable and productive city, we really need to have affordable housing for all parts of the income spectrum. So what we're very familiar with is this highest profit model. So you've got speculative development over there where developers are speculating on what the future residents might want. And at the other end, you've got crisis accommodation, public housing, affordable housing. And so these are also very crucial that we have the right strategies in place to deliver that type of housing. But this is sitting somewhere in the middle. So that's where you've got people who, are in a position where they're able to fund their own development and start to create something different that's in between. And I think what's very important is that examples such as Nightingale, which I'll talk more about later, they start to have 20% affordable housing in that model. So you're starting to get a more of a mixed community and making sure that you help deliver that type of housing as well. So 3 examples. I'm lucky enough to teach at the University of Melbourne with Andy Fergus, and we run a travelling studio. We take architecture students and urban design students to the Netherlands every year. It's a pretty great gig. But alongside, we take them to see some of these great housing models that are happening over there. And so the 3 examples here range from the more rural kind of outer suburban example to a bit more of an inner city suburban model, and finally a very urban model in Zurich. This one is called Gewürtelt Wohnen, and which essentially means grounded or rooted living. So it's being kind of grounded in your place. And it's a bit of play on words too, because also this particular one is 50 households that wanted to share more productive gardens as well. And so they chose a site that was halfway between Delft and The Hague in a kind of outer suburban area. And they managed to purchase the land, and the architect came on board quite early and to get this going. And so this is the architect here on the left, the way that they got this going was actually by setting up a market stall at farmers markets and promoting this idea and seeing who else would want to buy into this example. And so what you see is that this glorious kind of quite wild shared garden in the middle with a variety of houses around the edge. It was great kind of visiting with our students and meeting a lot of the residents that were there of all ages. And really the kids kind of run from one house to the next and have some shared things. So you can see even though it was all designed by one architect, they tried to get a bit of diversity in terms of the types of houses that are here. So it's about half apartments and half townhouses. So you have different price points, different suitability for different age groups. And they've also got a shared barn as well where they can have, small events and things like that. So a second example, this is for a new neighbourhood of Balkslanderham in the north of Amsterdam. So this is it's a bit of a different model. All of the land is owned by the City of Amsterdam. It's just to the north of across the river from the train station. And here the city had an initial plan, and it was to build a whole lot of market-led housing. But this was about in 2007, so we can guess what happened to that idea. So in 2008, all of the big developers weren't able to actually deliver this type of housing. And so they came up with this, which ultimately ended up being quite a good thing, because they've come up with an alternative proposal, and that is this concept of circular Balkslanderham. So that's circular in terms of waste, in terms of energy processes. They want it to be this living lab, this kind of test case of how you can have a sustainable community. And they also wanted to have citizen-led housing as well. And so this photo actually shows a kind of vacant land with people camping out, because they had this idea that they would carve up the site into a lot of different little sites, and then individual families could actually try and get in first to buy some very affordable land. And so they actually camped out to do that. Then they had a series of workshops with the different families so that their housing could work together with each other. And this is the result. So each one of these is actually a different family, has their own townhouse, 4 stories. And you can see just some of the beautiful qualities you get out of them being involved in doing that process together, because they've decided to not put up the front fences. The kids, again, are kind of running between all of these places. And most of them are single families, but in this example here, it's more of an apartment building. So again, that model of, 8 different families getting together and actually building that together. The final example that I wanted to show was in Zurich. So the photos I've included aren't that great because they're from the internet, but going there and visiting it was incredible. So this is an inner urban area. You've got the city of Zurich owned a tram depot. So in the heart of the city, this tram depot, trams stay there overnight. And so quite a large group got together and said, how can we make this land work a bit harder? And so how can we actually have housing on top of the tram depot and keep that tram depot in its place? So in this case, we've got a long-term lease from the city of Zurich, and they've literally kept the tram depot there and built housing on top of it. So what you see here is the ground floor, and they've kind of carefully curated which restaurants go in. They've also got an art house cinema and other things happening there. But then you take the steps up onto essentially the 3rd floor, and you've got this incredible kind of shared courtyard with playgrounds, and you've got 200 people living around here. So it's a very dense environment, but they've also got things like a small little hostel in here so people can come and stay. They've got bookable meeting rooms. It's really starting to build all the things you need in a community in one building. So it's quite an interesting model. And what they tried to do here as well is that of the 200 residents, they wanted to make them representative of Zurich. So they had people from all different income levels. They had people from different backgrounds. I think Zurich has 30% immigrants, so 30% of the people that live here are immigrants. So it's just, again, an incredible, in this case, it's a housing cooperative that have managed to deliver something that the market would never deliver. So what does this mean for Geelong? I think many of you in the room would be the first to say this kind of thing is already happening and has been happening for a long time, and I think Tim will talk more to that. But there's ways that we can continue to get this to grow, and there's a bit of a groundswell of interest in these things, and a lot of ideas are starting to push through and actually happen. So the first thing that we need to do is advocate for these different types of housing models. And so this is a workshop that Tim and I actually ran last year for Melbourne Design Week. And in this case, we got members of the public to come in and form their own little group of 10. And each one gave their budget of what they could afford, and then they were given the little coloured blocks that matched how much they could afford in terms of area. And then we played this great game of Tetris where everyone kind of debated where they got to be in the building. And so it was kind of simulating that idea of building that that little low-rise apartment building together. And it was quite interesting seeing what kind of things people prioritised, whether they wanted to prioritise sustainable options, having different types of energy systems and solar panels, or if they wanted to have a co-working space or something like that. So it was quite an interesting exercise. So definitely kind of getting the word out there, getting people familiar with this idea. And there's many, many examples of interesting versions of this. So this is actually in Munro Court in Castlemaine. I don't know if anyone knows this project, but it's eight different residents in here, led by Sam Cox and Lifehouse Design. And so they work together, and again, it's got that focus on really landscapes coming through quite strongly here, and other sustainable measures. I think who's heard of Nightingale? I think I'm a big fan of Nightingale, and I'm definitely planning to live in one in the future, but some of us have a bit of Nightingale saturation at some point. It's got a lot of press. So for those who don't know, Nightingale is somewhere on that spectrum that I was showing at the start. So it's a bit more towards market-led development, because it is an architect that has become the developer. But they have a whole lot of principles in terms of triple bottom line sustainability, greater sense of community, greater environmental measures, and also more affordable. So Nightingale 1 is already finished, and there's just recently 7 of these apartments have been approved in the same area. So there's actually Nightingale Village. It's a bit of a critical mass of this type of development happening. And people are really, I think that kind of prototype or that case study is so important for people to see, oh, this is what it's all about, this is how it works, and to get that government support to kind of grow it further. This is a project that I've worked on in Melbourne. So this is a former school site in kind of close to Ivanhoe, a suburb called Belfield. And so it's kind of a 3-hectare site that the council was wanting to sell for housing. And so we worked with them to say, how can we start to think about having more citizen-led development in this area and greater sustainable initiatives? So that was approved last week, which I'm very excited about. And we'll be excited to see what happens with that one. This one's a bit of a game changer, and this has also happened in February of this year, so everything's moving. This is one called the Freo Alternative. It's been going for a few years. It's a really interesting one to look up. So I was talking to Tim from Geelong Sustainability. It sounds like they're looking at very interesting, similar concepts. It's that idea of saying, how can we make that suburban housing work a little bit better? How can there be more shared green space? How can we have smaller housing sizes? And so they had a lot of workshops with the local community and came up with some priorities of what they wanted. And now this is actually going into the planning scheme and was approved in February. So trying to get some more innovative versions of what suburban housing is there. And then there's state policies. So I'm very interested in the role of things like the First Home Buyers Grant, because it's there are all of these economic levers that can happen. I'm a big fan of Dr. Andrea Sharam, who's from Swinburne, and she talks a lot about housing affordability. And the first thing she always says is, housing affordability, this is a completely man-made crisis. This is something that we can change. We know the levers, we just need to prioritise them and make sure that they happen. So if we could imagine if First Home Buyers Grant was only available for more sustainable living or more denser living, or how can we use these levers that we have to get the kind of outcomes that we want? So I've kind of given you a bit of a whirlwind through what is this deliberative development. We've seen some examples in Europe and some of these emerging ideas of how they can happen in Geelong. But I think there's so much potential here. I love this quote that talks about, I believe that the making of the city changes your relationship to it. The more people that actively take part in creating our city, the better it will be. The city is the ultimate crowdsourced project. So how can having that involvement in making your city actually make it a much better place? Thanks.
Catherine, that was very, very interesting. We're going to ask Tim to follow on from Property Collectives. Would you join with me in welcoming Tim? Thank you.
Hello. Thanks, Vicky. So my name's Tim, and I started Property Collectives back in 2010, so we've been going on for 8 years now. And this is a picture of our first project, which is in Northcote. And the genesis of this project was that myself, those two friends there and another friend who didn't make the photo shoot when the age came knocking, we got together and decided that we wanted to live around Northcote. We wanted to do a project together, but we wanted to do it, affordably. So we got together and we put in a quarter of the costs. Dan over there with his daughter Elka, he's an architect, so he designed it and I ran it, and after, in mid-2013 we finished it, and we all enjoyed living there together for probably about 3 or 4 years before kids started to arrive, and another friend had a dog and he decided that, being in a triple-storey townhouse with like a sort of 6-metre courtyard wasn't the best thing for the dog, so he decided to move on. But it was a really good experience, and at about the same time as we started to build this, I kind of thought, maybe other people are interested in doing something similar. And that was kind of the start of Property Collectives. So today I thought I'd talk a bit about what we're doing in Melbourne, go through a couple of case studies, and also talk a bit about key learnings over the last few years. So we are basically managing a citizen-led development model, and that brings people together to build inner-city homes at cost. The model is really kind of simple in that you're looking for people that are wanting the same sort of, or sharing the same objectives and values and wanting to get into a certain area. And we kind of bring the group together because they might come through as a group of friends who kind of want to get involved, or they might come through as just individuals who are sort of seeking the same thing. So we kind of play this bit of a curating role and bring these people together, and then we enable those people to become the developer. So by becoming the developer, the group takes on the risk of being a developer, but then also gets the reward, and the reward is that you get your home at cost. Sorry, my clicker is... So since 2014, sort of when we finished that first project, we've started 8 collectives using this model, and we're building 54 homes with 48 participants. And this is a picture from our last collective that we put together in West Brunswick. And this project was really interesting because it had a couple of people who were kind of refugees from the second stage of the Westwick Eco Village, which was, I think, Australia's first One Planet Living project. And stage 1 of that project, I think, finished maybe in the, someone's going to correct me, maybe in the late 90s or early 2000s. And then the project got into some trouble, and stage 2 didn't progress. So some of the people who were interested in being part of that eco village saw the opportunity to buy some of the site, and we bought it last June, and we're pulling together a project with 6 participants and 6 dwellings, and it looks like we might buy the next door neighbour as well, which would then increase that little community up to about 10. So these are all our current projects. We're very sort of concentrated in the inner north of Melbourne. There's a lot of demand. There's something in the water, I think, there, because that's where Nightingale is, and a lot of that activity seems to be focused around the inner north of Melbourne. We do have one outlier down in St Kilda, yeah. So these are all the current projects that we're managing. So I suppose the different thing about our model is the way that the projects get formed. You know, as opposed to a typical speculative development, one developer will buy a piece of land, they'll kind of speculate on what product is going to work there, they'll then get their planning permit and then they'll sell it. Whereas we do it completely the other way. We bring on the people, most of the people, before we buy the land. And so our projects are all allocated, you know, before we settle on the land. And so all the participants are then part of that design process and control the project all the way through. So at the start of the project, we have a lot of conversations with people about sort of what locations are they interested in and what sort of budget have they got. Like I said, they might be individuals or groups coming to us kind of wanting to find out how to do something like this. And we do have a mix of owner-occupiers and long-term investors, because it does take both to make these projects happen. And just because somebody's an investor, we don't sort of say no to them. But as long as they're doing it for the long term and their intention is aligned with the rest of the group in terms of delivering something of a higher quality, we bring them along the voyage as well. So once we sort of have a bit of a group forming, we do a finance assessment, and we go through a bit of a process around sharing the legal structures with them and making sure that they're comfortable with how everything works in the project, and then we have a thing called a participation agreement. And once we get at least 4 or 5 people committed to the next project, we then kick off the next project and we'll start looking for a site that meets the needs of those people. At the moment, all our projects are around 6 to 8. So it's interesting hearing what Catherine was saying about some of the scale in Europe as well. I sort of feel like around about 8 is probably the right sort of size for these sorts of projects, because you know, the participants are taking on a lot of responsibility and a lot of control. I think once you start to sort of get up to, you know, 20 or so, because you're all the participants are making the decisions about the project, I think decision making could potentially get a bit unwieldy when you have that many people. So yeah, so once we've got a critical mass formed, we'll start looking for the next site, and then we'll take that group through the whole process around land acquisition. And then once we've acquired the land, it is a very participatory process. You know, the model puts the participants in control of all the decisions around the project. You know, we act as the development managers, so we make a lot of proposals, and we will provide the groups with all the pros and cons of making different decisions on the way through, but ultimately it's up to the group to make the best decision for their group about all the decisions, from things like the location, who's the architect, the design, funding it, you know, what lender we go with, value management. I mean, every project is interesting in that we start with a budget, but you know, the decisions people make through the process around what they really, really want and what they're prepared to pay for is always a challenge in every project. Customisation, builder, specification. So how do we fund our projects? I suppose one of the barriers, to be honest, to participating in these projects is that we have a fairly sort of vanilla development funding model where we get bank lending for the land purchase, and then we get bank funding for the construction debt too. What this means is that the participants need to put in around 30 to 35% of the total project costs as a cash contribution to the project, which, you know, at the moment we're building, sorry, that's me for 10 minutes. We're building projects, townhouses for around about $1 million. So that's not something that everybody can afford. But we're looking at solutions to try and reduce that amount of capital on the way through. But this is the process at a high level. We do get bank funding for the land purchase and for the development finance, and then at the end of the process, everybody gets issued separate titles, and then they get their own mortgage against their title, and that pays out the construction debt. So a couple of projects. This first one is our 132 St George's Road project, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And I suppose probably the key design feature that made this project work for everybody was the decision to deprioritise car parking. So you'll see that there's no garages within sort of the lot boundary of each of the units. You can just sort of see next to those bins at the back that we reloaded all the car parks out the back to get them out of the way. And at the time, I don't know whether we really realised what we were doing. It was really just born of the fact that nobody really cared about their cars that much, so they wanted to give them a dedicated garage. But at the end of the day, because the carport comes off the back of the laneway and because all the bins are out there, that actually became a really social space, particularly when we started having kids and the kids wanted somewhere to play cricket or kick the soccer ball or play footy. So that was a really nice outcome because we've got a really, I think we've got probably a 1,500, maybe 2 metre setback to the street frontage before those balconies start. So it's a really activated street frontage. So you really getting to see your neighbours as you come out to work every day or taking the bins out. And then just a few shots of the interiors. And then this is our second project, which we finished just before Christmas. This is 7 townhouses, also in Northcote. That's Chris, who I met because we both have weekenders in Birregurra, and now we're living together in Northcote. And we've got 2 dwellings at the front of the block, and then there's 5 along the side. Now these dwellings are sort of, we just finished before Christmas, and the numbers here were each townhouse cost around about $1,050,000. And then when they got sort of valued for mortgages, they all sort of came in at about 1.2 to 1.3 mil. So that kind of gives you a sense of the level of savings that the group has made by doing a project under this model. So this is the same slide that Catherine presented in a different format, and courtesy of Andy Fergus. And I suppose I've learnt about this whole space through just getting involved in this space and doing it. And I suppose this places what we're doing in a bit of context with some other developers and other housing models that are operating in Melbourne. And you'll kind of see that we're pretty much slap bang in the middle. It's really just a break-even model, which is geared for ownership. You know, it's not a rental cooperative or a rental model or anything. It's really just around ownership and getting homes at cost. I think the whole reason we exist is really because there's a lack of trust in developers to deliver housing that people want. And I'm kind of always surprised at the amount of interest we get just because of that fact alone. And when I talk to people about why they're doing it, it really is cost, I suppose, as a threshold sort of driver for people. But coming in pretty quickly after that are, people are wanting to control the quality of their homes, and they are also wanting to create some community. So in terms of the keys to citizen-led housing, I suppose this is more just, what I've observed over the last few years. I think it's really important if you are thinking about starting up a project using a sort of alternative model that you really need a very simple and compelling proposition. If I think about what we've done over the last few years, really, we've put these 8 projects together because there just happens to be a demand for architecturally designed 3-bedroom townhouses in the inner city of Melbourne, and people are wanting that. And so they're coming to us because they're looking for an alternative. So whatever that project is that you're thinking about, just making sure that it's a really simple proposition that people can get their heads around is important. The numbers and funding are really key. We have conversations with people right up front about how much it's going to cost, how much debt you're going to take on, the fact that you're probably going to have to be jointly and severally liable for the full amount of the debt, on the way through. So understanding that up front is really important so you can have the right conversations with people. Otherwise, people might be wasting their time, and that's sort of aligned to this point in the middle, turning interest into commitment. I think everybody's very interested in exploring these alternative models, but what's that tipping point around when people will sort of commit to something or not? Well, invariably, I think it's about, well, how much is it going to cost me and how long is it going to take? So I think that second point's really, really, really important, and, finding funders who are going to back in the model is difficult, particularly if you're trying to do something different. But the hard work needs to go in early on to solve for that. Professional advice, I think, doing a development's not that easy, so I think getting some good advice and getting the right consultants involved early on is really important. And the last 2 points really are about making sure that socially the structure that you're doing is doing the right things by the participants. So, prioritising collective interests over individual interest, I think, is really important to sort of enshrine in any sort of agreement or manifesto you want to create. And then also being transparent and fair, I think that's really important too. And it's one of the refreshing things about this sort of model, for me at least, is that there's nothing in it for me to not be transparent about the process, because I kind of have to be. It's a lot harder to not be transparent and bring people along on the journey than actually just being transparent. And this last point, so this is the Westwick project, and I think what we've learnt over the last few years is that, we started off doing townhouses, and that was great because lots of people like townhouses, but increasingly we've got a lot of people who are looking to downsize, and they really aren't interested in having the three-storey townhouses. They want a single level, and for a long time we were just saying, we can't really help you out with that. Alternatively, people don't have the sort of budget to participate in our projects for a townhouse, sort of a 3-bedroom townhouse product. So this project's very interesting, exciting for us, because it's the first one where we're starting to introduce apartment typology in there to sort of meet the needs of a wider section of society, which is great. And thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. There were some very interesting projects there and some very useful insights for where we head. I'd like to invite Lisa Garner to come to the stage for her presentation. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. So I think it's really great actually that Catherine and Tim spoke first, because they really talked about some of the amazing architectural and examples that are out there and delivery models. And part of what I'm doing at Swinburne, working on a project called Greening the Greyfields, is finding a way to enable those sorts of projects to happen in our existing suburban environment, which is quite challenging, that a lot of it's sort of already been developed and there are a lot of planning controls. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And then I'm going to talk a bit about a design proposal, which is essentially a prototype looking into the same issues as Greening the Greyfields, really about finding a new way to redevelop existing suburban land that's more sustainable, more community-led, and offering more benefits to the neighbourhood. Sorry. Yeah. Still struggling. Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm holding it upside down. So most people probably don't know what the term greyfield, but you probably know about greenfields and brownfields. So greenfield is the redevelopment that's happening on our peri-urban sites, so new houses being built. Brownfields relates to the redevelopment of industrial sites. Greyfields is a term that was coined by a professor at our institute, which is it relates to the lot-by-lot redevelopment that's just happening in existing areas, so where houses are being knocked down and replaced with new houses. So our research was looking at the occurrence of this kind of knockdown rebuild that was happening, and this is a middle ring suburb of Melbourne over 10 years. So we noticed that this kind of development is happening in a very uncontrolled way, and it's piecemeal and it's individual. It's not really delivering the kind of housing that's expected to be achieved in these areas, or any of the government targets. So it keeps going. It's really quite inefficient. And just out of interest, I had a look at some planning documents about Geelong. So this is Geelong West, and a map that's identified, so in red, houses that have been redeveloped over the last 10 years. So it seems like a pattern that's starting to occur in suburbs here. And the problem with this kind of development, and as I said before, is that it's not really providing much more new housing. It's typically just replaced by one big house. Or you'll see these kind of developments, which we call the battle axe driveway, where you've got sometimes 2, 3, or 4, or 6 over 2 lots. And the problem with these is they're not really providing much household diversity. They're really all 3-bedroom suburban houses. As you can see, there's not much garden space, sort of very big concreted areas, and all of the trees are removed. And what you can also, does this actually have a pointer? Yeah. You sort of get these perimeter outdoor spaces and pretty crappy outlook from your window, very small windows, screening, and that all relates to the planning controls, which try and limit, your overlooking onto your neighbour's property. And obviously to make way for private double garages, you're getting large concreted areas, not very social spaces, and no engagement with the streetscape. So they're not really creating ideal neighbourhoods. So this is us also just speculating on what would start to happen if this development continues. So an existing kind of suburban area, if everybody starts developing with this kind of business as usual approach, which will happen if we sort of don't intervene, we're going to see a lot of green area disappearing, a lot of trees going. And so the premise of the whole idea of greening the greyfields is really about how can we start to see a more coordinated or precinct scale approach to renewal happening. So it's really about finding a way to incentivize and bring landowners together to redevelop their land together. Because as you can see, as soon as you get a couple of blocks together, the kind of design outcomes that you can achieve just vastly increase. There's opportunities, to have thoroughfares through the blocks. You can have bigger open spaces. Development can work around the existing trees. So there's really a lot of benefits to thinking in this way. But obviously, that's really hard to achieve, in existing areas where people live. And that's really what we're trying to work towards developing in terms of a framework, greening the grey fields. So that's just, I guess, sort of our objectives again. And this is how we're currently working on achieving that. So since about a year now, we've been working with Maroondah Council, which is a council in Melbourne. And we've got funding from Water Sensitive Cities and Carbon Centre for Research, and support from the Victorian Government to try and come up with a targeted approach to renewal. So with Maroondah, we've actually now sort of designated a precinct, which will sort of be targeting for renewal. And that area was shown to have a very high redevelopment potential, so the houses were pretty much reaching the end of their lifespan. Subdivision was already starting to occur. So the next step then was to get the landowners and the community on board and start to talk about this precinct and get a sense of some of the things they want to see happening. So the main things were about, new pedestrian access through the block to the park in the middle, really about more walkability throughout the precinct. So about getting their feedback and trying to translate that into a sort of a precinct concept plan. And the next step really was about coming up with sort of new design guidelines for all future redevelopment that would occur, within the boundary of this precinct. And then think about incentives to really get people on board with this approach. So, this is still a work in progress, and we've been thinking a lot about how we can really incentivize people to get on board. But the main idea now is that if the landowners amalgamate and sort of develop in accordance to the concept plan and comply with our design requirements and achieve, really good environmental performance outcomes, we'd be, offering the opportunity to build higher. We would waive the subdivision fees, which are usually associated with that, and potentially waive or sort of cancel out any opportunity for third-party appeal rights, which is people sort of opposing to the development. So for me as an architect, my role has been really about thinking about what kind of outcomes do we want to see, taking all those issues of the current development on board. What kind of, what's the better outcome? So these are really some of the objectives, which is really about more density, better built form, design that addresses the street front, better communal outdoor areas, better amenity, better landscape design solutions, retaining existing trees. So, and exploring a number of different typologies for a number of different lot size. Really a sort of a design exercise to see what's possible and to be able to communicate with the landowners about what you could do. So just some of the options. And then seeing how those new typologies really push against the existing planning controls, so Res Code, to see how we need to change them, or whether we need to tighten them in order to allow or to make possible what we're trying to do. So some of the main things we're looking at now is actually decreasing the built footprint of buildings in exchange for greater height, reducing the front setbacks, reducing the driveway areas, and finding new solutions to deal with the overlooking issues so that we don't have some small windows and screens on our boundaries. And then, of course, sort of testing the feasibility of those designs to show that for the landowners as well, that it actually is more profitable when you join a couple of blocks of land in terms of the yield that you can get. And then also demonstrating some examples through a case study. So this is the northwest corner of our precinct, and this was just taking sort of 3 of the typologies that I was testing and inserting them into sort of 3 potential amalgamations, and taking on board that input from the community about potentially opening up this laneway that was just not used, and creating a connection through to the park and a connection through from this side, and showing before and after images. So this is what it might look like from that top street if you were to build business as usual development. But this is what it could look like if you had all the dwellings, addressing that laneway area, new types of townhouses. Sorry, the same before and after, this view from the park, where you've got your standard approach, high fences, not much passive surveillance, or an alternative approach, and same sort of visualizations really to kind of get people excited about development, because there definitely is a lot of resistance to change and development, and for most people anything outside of the status quo is a bit scary, but I think it's really important to give people a vision of what it could be. So that's that progress in summary. It's still in progress. There are definitely a lot of hurdles. We're in the process of preparing a planning scheme amendment, but I guess the goal is really to demonstrate a planning framework that you could also apply to any suburban area. So whether it's Geelong here, because I'm sure that there are a lot of ageing suburban areas that could do with something like this. So we hope that if this approach is successful, it could be something that could be replicated. So the next project I'm going to talk about, it's an architectural prototype that I developed originally as part of my architecture thesis, because I'd sort of been interested in this topic for a long time, actually.
Sorry guys for the technical issue. I did not go through the entire...
It was a really big file. Lots of big images.
Have you got your laptop?
Yeah.
Can we plug in another laptop?
Yep.
It's a MacBook.
Oh, does that have HDMI?
I don't know. I'll find out. Have you got HDMI on it? Yeah. Yeah, great. Yes. It's a fancy.
So, what was it? Yep, architectural proposal. And that I'd started to think about, I'd be interested in new forms of housing quite a while ago. As I was living for 7 years in Berlin, where I was studying architecture and so working as an architect, and really having this exposure to some incredible housing projects, and some of them being projects that I worked on in the top, and even living in incredible buildings. So here, this is me having Easter lunch on the street and my view from my window, and kind of comparing these incredible projects to the kind of housing that was on offer in Melbourne. And this is actually where I currently live, and that's the view from my room. And just thinking that there really has to be an alternative. So that's when I started to work on this project, which I submitted into a competition early last year, and ended up winning the competition, which was really exciting. So I've been continuing to work on that, but I'll just share a bit of the design ideas behind that, because it's really an example of how you could approach building in the suburbs sort of differently. So I was looking at a similar issue to Green in the Greyfields, the fact that this kind of piecemeal development is happening everywhere. But what I also found interesting is that all of these plots of land are really almost alarmingly have the same sort of dimension. So they're pretty much always 15 metres wide and 45 metres deep, which actually really lends itself to a like a scalable and a flexible typology, almost like a prefabricated system that you could apply and adapt to different kinds of lot amalgamations. And so that was the beginning in thinking about this typology. This is a physical model of the project, which is I came up with really to push the boundaries, and turn from what was previously just a front and a back garden into a sort of continuous network of courtyards and open spaces and sort of 3-story townhouses with their own voids and courtyards. And the main idea of this typology was, so the maximum height in a lot of these areas of Melbourne is 3 stories. So working with that 3 stories and thinking about actually keeping the ground floor open as a kind of communal open space, and sort of elevating the living areas so that sort of on a structural podium, actually, so that the roots of trees can actually grow, and you sort of get the benefit of the tree canopy at the living levels. And so here's some sort of visualizations of what that ground floor could really look like. And this was really about bringing people back into contact with nature and with each other. So the townhouses are all spread over 3 levels, but everyone has their private entry on the ground floor, which opens out onto this sort of green communal space. So you actually get to see your neighbours, and because this structure is taking all the load, you could flexibly design the spaces on the ground floor however you wanted. And then sort of the level above is where you really have your kind of private or enclosed space. So living spaces are enclosed in a sort of courtyard wall, and that's really sort of your private space. And then the top floor, where you really have this view to the horizon, and you have this outlook, and you can sort of see your neighbours, but it was really about having a home where you've got this diversity and richness of spaces at all levels. And then sort of conceiving that design really as a kind of kit of parts. So working with the sort of 15 metres and 7.5 metre column grid and 3.75 metre floor and wall panels that could be reconfigured to create housing, depending on what the residents wanted or need, or could easily build around the existing trees. So it's really sort of like a flexible kit of parts. And through that, being able to achieve quite like a diversity of unit types for different kinds of needs. This is sort of 3 different apartment types that you find in this development. And now, sort of in bringing that design back to, we're trying to bring that to fruition. It's sort of now been I've sort of scaled that back to do a sort of feasibility study on 2 lots side by side, making the design res code compliant. So you can see now there are setbacks and sort of respecting all of the overlooking issues, which has been quite a challenge to make this fully compliant. And sort of begun to reach out to people like Tim in the Property Collective to see how a design like this could be delivered through this, citizen-led model. And yeah, so they're really just, I don't really know how to summarise it all, but I guess 2 examples of what you could do to address the issues that we're seeing in Melbourne and here with regards to poor business as usual outcomes in the suburbs. On the one hand from a planning point of view, and on the other hand sort of from as a design typology. So I hope that they can sort of provide some inspiration. But yeah, thank you.
Well, I think there's a few of us saying, I'd like to live there. Very, very inspiring. Now, I would like to invite Lisa and Catherine and Tim up to the stage, to these gorgeous, comfy chairs. And we're going to throw it open for questions. And Tim is at the back with the microphone. Does that mean he gets the first question?
Yeah, he who holds the microphone
Has
gets
all the
ask
power.
questions. I guess a quick question for Tim to start off. Given the response that we've had to the Royal Commission into the banking industry and subsequent restriction in the flow of funds to projects like this, I've noticed that traditional small developer business model is potentially now struggling to be able to gain access to funds. Have you made any direct experience of how your model might in fact be able to leapfrog the traditional model because of this restriction in funding that's available?
Yep. So one of the good things about Hayne was we're looking at funding our St Kilda project through Bank of Melbourne, and all the banks, apart from Bank Australia, we're also banking with Bank Australia for our Westwick one. And all the banks usually want joint and several liability. And for people that don't understand that, if your construction loan's $4 million, joint and several liability means that all the participants would be all liable for $4 million, as opposed to, say, 1/7 or 1/8 of $4 million. Bank Australia get that, and they offered several liability off the bat. But Bank of Melbourne turned around and said, under responsible banking guidelines, we're not going to want joint and several, we're going to want several. So that's kind of on the positive side. The other thing I suppose our model has the advantage of is, the banks are always going to look for how many have you pre-sold. So they've got their thresholds on X% being pre-sold tied to Y% funding. I mean, our model, it's 100% pre-sold from the start. So that's an advantage that we have. The flip side is that because we're doing something different, not all the banks really want to pay you any attention and try and do something different. So I think for us, it's definitely going to be a challenging year because we always get the banks will always look at what we're doing through a typical developer's lens. And so, you know, we're just subject to valuations like everybody else. Valuations are falling. You know, the banks are being more cautious. So, you know, it's definitely going to make it more difficult for us. But, you know, that's just how it is at the moment. It's not going to stop what we're doing, but yeah.
Petra.
Thank you to everyone here. One of the things that I have a challenge with, and I was just thinking you've been to Germany, and I suppose having been in Europe, one of the things that I've seen over there, we have 400 plus year houses. And when I went to one of the housing sustainability things, one of them said, we build them for 25 years. And I'm thinking, we're never going to get there. So I suppose my question is, and I understand most of you in the designing and creativity stage, but how do we get to that with sustainable products, looking at, you know, sustainability all the way through? So I'm not sure who would be best to answer that, but yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I can start. I think it's all about regulation. It's just incredible going to these homes in Amsterdam or Zurich, and double glazing is not the norm because triple glazing is, and it's just standard over there. And I think I was having a bit of a chat to Tim actually earlier about how regulation is key in terms of making sure we lift the base level and get everything up to a slightly higher rate. And it's interesting how companies and developers respond to that. And it's, you know, once everyone's on that same playing field, then it's easy to get that, you know, it's not a big cut out of their profit or anything like that, because you start to have greater amounts of that product coming in and it gets cheaper and that kind of thing. And yeah. In terms of regulation, I think I'm always a big fan of the agency that we all have as citizens, in that we can be, you know, talking to our MPs, we can be signing petitions, we can be putting these things forward. So it's, you know, if that's something we're really focused on, then how can we actually try and get that happening as well?
I think I agree that, yeah, regulation is certainly a good starting point, and I think the industry is starting to change. There is more awareness, but it seems like one of the biggest hurdles, or what builders typically tend to say, is, you know, the added cost, because right now it is more expensive because it's sort of outside of the norm. But the more and more we start to build in a more sustainable way, and the more that those products come on the market, I guess the more affordable they're going to become. And I think it's also about educating, more awareness and education about the cost benefit of building in that way in terms of reduced energy costs. So the cost savings over 20 years actually, you know, could outweigh that additional cost at the beginning, but we just don't have enough foresight and we don't think about that. So more awareness about that.
I guess that's why we're so passionate about citizen-led options, because if you're the one that's making that decision, you can choose to have that. And that ties into that idea of the case study as well. These can be the projects that are really leading the way and showing that it's possible and not too difficult.
Yeah, and I think just on that, so the Westwick project that I was talking about that we're doing, that group of people in that project, they wanted a really high performing building for that project, and it was funny because at the time we were talking to Bank Australia about funding our projects, and they just decided that they wanted to fund private developments, but they had decided that they wanted to support models that were making it more affordable, but also creating better quality buildings. And so Bank Australia said, yeah, we'll give you more debt than we would get on the open market, and we'll give it to you cheaper, but it has to be 8 stars. And we said, sure, because, you know, that's what our group wants anyway. So, you know, little things like that are happening, and, you know, that project's going to be a really great one to deliver, because it's going to be another sort of prototype, as Catherine was saying, that then maybe can stimulate, you know, more projects of a similar nature.
Just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question.
Sorry.
You go.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very interested in, you know, living not in such a high, you know, urban dense environment, more a rural living sort of setup, perhaps multiple dwellings on a rural living zone. Sounds really attractive to me. Is anyone working in that sort of space, peri-urban sort of stuff?
I'd love to do a project like that too. Completely as an aside, when I went to South Africa a few years ago, I went to this camp, and they sort of had this central living. They had a sort of a central kitchen dining zone, I think, with one bedroom in there and some toilets, and then everybody sort of had these rondavelles outside with just sort of more of a bedroom kind of unit. And I was like, this is awesome, you know. I'd love to do a project like that. We're not working on a project like that at the moment, but I think it's challenging in rural zones, you know, to sort of get those concessions, you know, where you're only having to do, you know, one lot for every X amount of acres, or one house for every X amount of acres. I haven't looked into it into too much detail, but I know I've had similar conversations with multiple people who are all interested in doing projects like that, but I'm not aware of anything sort of, you know, happening at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think I quite like, I don't know if you've heard of urban coupe. They actually have a phrase, you know, you can choose to be close and tall or far and wide. So it's the idea that either you build kind of densely or you have more space, but you're way at the edge of the city or in a rural area. But I think what you're starting to flag is that there are kind of planning restrictions on being able to have so many small dwellings on one lot. And one way I've heard of getting around it is if you actually have a group accommodation. So it's kind of like if you set it up like it was a B&B or something like that. But obviously it's, you know, that's only works if you're living in some sort of cooperative and that you jointly own it. And that's A, not what everyone wants to do, and B, difficult to finance as well because you won't have your individual mortgage. So I think, yeah, some of the barriers to that model.
Hello. How can you get volume builders like Metricon to take on your concept?
I don't think you can. I don't think you can. I think they've got a very specific sort of business model. Catherine might be able to talk with a bit more authority about the name's just escaping me. The cluster home builders back in the 60s. There's probably the
Merchant builders.
merchant builders. I mean, that's probably the closest thing, but I mean, not on the scale of Metricon.
Yeah, I'm sure some people in the room have heard of merchant builders, but they delivered this model that was often in what was then the edge of the city, in these kind of where you did have a shared kind of green space and then several homes. But in that case, they were not volume builders. It was very much still, you know, there were only ever 8 or so dwellings in each one, so they didn't do that scale. But I think one of the issues that we have is that our volume builder market is actually one of the most efficient and cheap ways of building houses in the world. And so they've really got it. They've got it down to this fine science of like, how do you build it as cheap as possible? And so, you know, I'm not sure how our models would appeal to them in that what they're already doing is so much cheaper. And they're...
I think I definitely toyed with the idea of taking my model to someone like Metricon, but the main concern was that they might kind of sabotage it. And they probably would, but certainly wouldn't have a problem with making good design accessible to the wider public, and they'd probably have some clever ways of making it more affordable. So,
the answer is probably if it's a market-driven thing, then, you know, businesses like that might turn their mind to it. if they're seeing
Yeah.
that there's a market
Yeah.
that's not being
Yeah.
met. Which gets back to the prototype sort of, point that Catherine was making. The more sort of prototypes, that happen, the more sort of innovation that can sort of emerge.
If we've got any more questions, you'd like to raise your hands. Oh, one down here, one at the back. Yep.
Just go.
Peter, yeah?
Yeah, just a question for you, Tim. The collective model that you've got people living in and have been for perhaps, 10 years now, the socialising aspect is very, very important, as we said right at the start. How has that panned out?
Well, in the first project, it was very social because we were all friends. I think the test is going to be with the next layer of projects where it's a diverse group of people that are coming together. And Clark Street was probably the first one where it was a couple of my friends and then a couple of friends' friends, and it was a bit of a disjointed group. We've just all moved in just before Christmas. So there's been a couple of dinner parties and there's been a couple of social events, but things are kind of still evolving around that. But I think it comes out in the types of typology that and the designs. So far, particularly with the townhouse product, it's a bit of a sort of a community light type of approach. People don't typically want a massive body owners corporation, and they kind of like the fact that, yes, we're going to be living close together, but they kind of want their own private space too. So in most of the projects, there's actually not that much communal space. And that's probably a function of the fact that we're buying really dense infill sites where there's actually not that much space to work with. The Westwick project is going to be very different because we do actually have quite a bit of space. And it's actually quite a bad orientation for 8 stars. So we've got this massive sort of 9-metre communal open space running through the middle of the site because everybody wants to open up onto that communal space. So it is a bit different project by project and sort of site by site, in terms of, the brief for that project and what everybody's wanting out of it. So it's not a very eloquent answer for you, but it's kind of evolving, and it is sort of a project by project thing.
I think to take another local example, with the Nightingale project that I put up there, I think pretty sure there's been a marriage that's come out of Nightingale, some children, there's people have actually met through the process, and they have, in that model, they've got a communal rooftop, there's bees on the roof, you have your laundry up on the roof as well. And so it becomes a place you actually have a chance to run into people to gather. And I don't live there yet, but I'm definitely planning to at some point. And it's interesting, the few people that I know, I'm sitting out on the street talking to someone, and then you see 3 people that go past. And I think it's just such a valuable thing in this very, in the world that we've set up somehow brings people further apart. And so having models like this are really interesting to see how we can get a bit close together again.
Yeah, my question's for Tim again. You're very popular. Tim, you spoke about some projects you're involved with at the moment. I think you were talking about one you were working on at the moment and one that you just completed, and you mentioned sort of like $1 million per unit figure. I'm just curious as to take that $1 million number, what the breakup is between the land value versus the building value and whatever the other add-ons are.
Yeah. The land for Clark Street was about $325,000 per lot for the 7 lots. The build was a bit over $500,000, and the rest was council fees, professional fees, and funding fees. So that was kind of the breakup. And, in Melbourne, you kind of need to try and buy the land for about $300 per lot. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. and I'm sure that there'll be a number that's similar for Geelong. You know, it's probably not 300, but you know, the ratios are probably fairly similar.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking it's a bit hard to compete against the Metricons who can, who can build it for 200,000 thereabouts. And I know that's the bare things, but your market is fairly limited.
Yeah.
And I thought we were talking about affordable housing, and I'm in a bit of shock and awe at the moment.
Yeah, and look, we're very deliberately doing these projects in a certain area of a certain scale because that's the areas where they can support these types of projects. You know, I think it is different in different areas. In a Geelong, it might be that the projects need to be a bit bigger, you know, to make the economies work for all the participants. You know, it might need to be 12 or 15 dwellings, not sort of 6, you know. And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're starting to get inquiries from all over Australia, and it's interesting the markets where it seems to work. It is quite a niche thing at the moment in its current form. Yeah, and I think if you to take the model and sort of transplant it to somewhere like Geelong, there'd have to be a fair bit of work around the economics of it to work out, okay, well, what is that scale that it kind of works for everybody, you know?
Hi, yeah. I just wondered if you knew of any projects where the collective for older people, because I heard of one in London in the UK where a group of older people sort of thought ahead and they had sustainable housing and then they could later buy in any care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's such a great model, and it's interesting that when we speak to people that run these types of projects, they're quite interested that the average age is a little bit higher than they expected it to be. And I think that, yeah, that's going to be the obvious people that are leading the way in this field, because they're people that may already have their own home and have that ability to kind of invest in the next one. And yeah, that's why I started the presentation with, you know, where are you going to be living in 20 years? Because I think it's a conversation we should have, and do we want to live with our friends? I know that my boss is in that, doing exactly that. So he is planning to build one of these with 3 couples, and so that they can perhaps share a carer that comes there. And importantly, it's so if he passes away, his partner has others close to him that can look after him. So yeah, it's a great one. I'm trying to think of, yeah, I can't think of an example that I've visited, but it seems like an obvious choice. I think they're often much smaller ones.
Hi, my question's to Liz. I'm interested a little bit more down the right end of the spectrum in the social housing, the need for 300,000 units of social housing over the next 5 years in Australia. And I'm interested in the Greyfield development because that's very much what affordable housing associations are doing, but also those developments are possible in places where there's employment, there's access to services, etc., which is really what social housing clients need. I'm also fascinated in what you're doing around looking at planning schemes almost for those precincts. And I'm wondering what levers or what thoughts have you given about how you can, and I'm not necessarily thinking inclusionary zoning, but that's one, about how you can actually, within those precincts, provide for social housing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and you make a good point that it's a really suitable location for social housing, and it's something that we haven't, for that precinct, we haven't thought about too much because we've decided to focus our objectives really on the sustainability and the greening, and for Maroondah it's really about the green space and the trees. So we haven't really, yeah, that's true, we actually haven't looked into it.
I think a lot of your focus has been on incentives for landowners to amalgamate their lots too, so it's not so much about targeting end developers, you know, it's encouraging.
Yeah.
lot consolidation.
Yeah.
But which doesn't answer your questions.
Yeah. I think there are a number of strategies underway. I know in Melbourne anyway, the state government looking at redevelopment of sort of existing public housing. But I don't know too much about it. But yeah.
So I am running an event at Melbourne Design Week. It's a public forum about affordable housing. So that's going to be at the NGV on March 15, if you're interested. And so we'll have a panel of Rob McGorrin from MGS Architects. So my office does deliver a lot of affordable and social housing. We'll have Kate Breen. So she is from Affordable Housing Solutions or something like that. She's actually a consultant that helps facilitate these projects. We'll have Chris Daff, who's a developer, but he's a developer that's tried to incorporate affordable housing in his projects. And finally, we'll have Kate Grant. So she has lived in social housing, so she can bring that, and affordable housing can bring that side of it as well. But yeah, I don't have the answers for you right now.
It's an emerging area.
Oh, it is.
There's lots of things happening
And
in Victoria at the moment. And
that's right.
Like there's always balls up in the air, and we're still waiting to see what
yeah.
what opportunities they'll present for us.
Exactly. So there is that $1 billion fund that the state government has available for different housing associations. We're still working out how to use that, and I think it was a bit of an election promise for the opposition at a federal scale that they would start something up again like NRAS. So hopefully we get the right channels in place from the government to enable these types of things.
And I probably should acknowledge June Wager has just departed, but the City of Greater Geelong, and she's responsible for leading a major piece of work where they have been given state government funding to do a social housing policy and strategy for Geelong. So that piece of work is happening at the moment. They have consultants in place and a reference panel will be happening. Could I just do a little bit of a straw poll? How many people think they might be interested in exploring a property collective style development? Okay, yeah. And how many people are perhaps more passionate about the affordable housing style type? Okay, probably a mixture. Yeah, excellent. No worries. Are there any more questions? One more question, maybe? No? Oh, yes. Can I ask quickly one while the microphone's getting passed around? So how do we get these planning regs changed so that we can do these things now, tomorrow? Rhetorical question.
Lisa's working on it.
It's unbelievably difficult. And I came into Green and Greyfields project quite late, but it's been about 5 years, I think, of the professors at Swinburne, cutting through to that state level. Green in the Greyfields is now in Plan Melbourne. It's in there that they know they have to deliver on this, but there's not that much support, really, and funding to make it a reality. But yeah, we'll see.
Just a quick question for Tim. Do your collectives, do they get to decide on the architect and the builders, or do you have a selection of people that you always go to? How do you do that?
When we were starting, we had a selection that we always go to, and recently we've started to widen it out. So, so the last couple of collectives have sort of come forward with their list, and we've gone through a selection panel, a selection process. So, yeah, there's quite a few projects now, and it's sort of evolving. So, we'd like to get it to a point, particularly with the builders, where we sort of have probably 2 or 3 that we're working with a lot, and we can kind of involve them in the design process. We're not quite there yet. But yeah, architects are definitely starting to widen it out and sort of, and actually there's actually quite a lot of architects in our projects, because they're kind of interested in doing these sorts of projects. So they might not necessarily be the lead architect, but and I'm always interested in that dynamic to see how that sort of pans out. But there's probably about, I don't know, 5 or 6 architects across the different projects who are involved. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, if you would like to join with me in thanking Tim and Lisa and Catherine for a very stimulating talk. And I would like to acknowledge that Andy Fergus, who was going to be one of our presenters and then thought he was going to be detained, actually come down from Melbourne anyway. So, Andy, thank you very much for coming down. I would like to thank Kaz Kopic and Brian and Phoebe and all of the staff of the library. It's a wonderful partnership that we enjoy putting on these Clever Living seminars here. There are booklets over there with all of the events that are happening for Melbourne Design Week, which have been provided. So please grab one. There's an amazing range of things happening. We, Geelong Sustainability, oh yes, you can sign our Cash for Containers petition on the way out if you really want to. That would be great. And we're going to take that to council and present it, hopefully with some students as well in a couple of weeks' time. So what else? So Geelong Sustainability is committed. We were approached by Geelong and Bellarine Tiny Homes Group last year, and we think, having coordinated Sustainable House Day for a long while and seen the lack of sustainable housing, no exceptions. There's some example, Seamus O'Reilly has done some beautiful homes and that have been opened, including large and tiny. But we really, the paradigm's got to change. 85% of our housing stock is standalone suburban. That business, as usual, is pretty scary, much less what they are building on the outskirts to the north and to the west of Geelong. They are going to add the equivalent of 2 new Ballarats. So we're talking about 50,000 homes over the next. We have to do better. We have to build smaller. So live small, live eco is going to be our mantra going forward. Geelong Sustainability is partnering not only with the Geelong and Bellarine Tiny Homes groups, but also Deakin Home, who have a research project going. And is David still here? No? Okay. So they have appointed a research fellow. They have received some funding from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund, and that is going to be looking at the technical constraints and funding options to actually do affordable housing. So going forward, we're really committed to work towards achieving a pilot exemplar project in Geelong. And so if any of you are interested, please stay in touch. And our workshop on the 22nd of March is actually booked out. But so we're really, really hoping that's a really good sign for a real strong interest. Let's try and do something different and better in Geelong. And I'd just like to very quickly remind you that our next Clever Living seminar is actually going to be about climate-proofing your home. And so we have got an architect who specialises in renovations and how to get the best value out of doing the retrofits to your home, and also Dan Cadell, who will be able to talk about the Victorian Residential Energy Scorecard. So that's on the Tuesday, the 16th of April, and that bookings for that will open shortly. And without further ado, I'd like to thank you very much for your participation tonight. And Sarah has got some small gifts to give to our presenters. If you join with me in thanking them one more time. Thank you.